Victoria Harmon stood in the middle of a small Brooklyn restaurant and swept an entire stack of ceramic plates off the counter with one motion. The crash echoed against the walls. Chairs were overturned. A mirror split clean down the center, and every staff member pressed themselves flat against the wall without making a sound. The man across from her did not flinch, did not step back, did not say a single word. He just looked at her steady, unreadable, like someone who had already survived something far worse than this. Victoria turned and walked out, certain she had won. She had no way of knowing that a medical file waiting for her at a hospital across the river was about to make that certainty collapse entirely. Victoria Harmon had never lost a deal in 7 years of running Harmon Capital. Not because she was lucky, because she treated every transaction the same way. Identify the number that makes a person say, yes, put it on the table, and wait. People always said yes eventually. That was the only rule she had ever needed. She had built Harmon Capital from a mid-sized real estate firm into one of Manhattan's most aggressive development groups before she turned 35. The offices occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower on 57th Street. Her name was on the building's lobby directory in clean silver letters. She wore that fact lightly, the way people wear things they've stopped needing to prove. 3 years earlier, something had almost ended all of it. A sudden liver failure, no warning, no prior history had put her in a hospital bed for 6 weeks. The surgery that saved her life involved a partial liver transplant from an anonymous donor. The donor's identity was sealed under medical privacy protocol, and Victoria had never pushed to find out. She had walked out of the hospital, gone back to work inside of 2 months, and told herself the only appropriate response to surviving something like that was to keep moving. She had kept moving ever since. The Brooklyn redevelopment project was straightforward on paper. Harmon Capital had acquired most of a 4-block stretch near the waterfront, aging storefronts, a closed laundromat, 2 vacant lots. The plan was a mixed-use complex residential towers retail on the ground level, a rooftop park. Clean, profitable. The kind of project that got written up in architecture magazines. There was one property sitting at the center of the footprint that had not yet been acquired. A restaurant called Reeves & Sons. Victoria reviewed the file on a Tuesday morning. The property was valued at roughly $800,000. She had authorized an offer of $2.4 million, 3 times market clean, closed no contingencies. Her acquisitions team had already sent the initial letter. The owner had not responded. She decided to handle it herself. She drove to Brooklyn on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. Victoria Harmon did not typically visit properties in person at the offer stage, but something about the silence from the other side irritated her in a way she couldn't fully account for, and she had learned to trust that irritation as a signal worth following. Reeves & Sons occupied a narrow corner building with dark wood trim and a hand-painted sign above the door. The lunch service was winding down when she walked in. The dining room held maybe 30 covers, mismatched chairs, a long oak bar along one wall, framed photographs covering most of the available space. The smell of whatever was still on the stove was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was Daniel Reeves, who came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a cloth and looked at her without any particular expression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness in his posture that read as either confidence or exhaustion, or possibly both. Victoria introduced herself without extending a hand and told him she was there to discuss the acquisition offer. Daniel listened, then told her to sit down. She sat. He brought 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her, which she did not touch. "I've seen the offer," Daniel said. "I'm not selling." Victoria kept her voice even. She explained the scope of the project, the timeline, the fact that the surrounding properties had already been secured. She mentioned that holding out would eventually complicate things for everyone. She did not use the word pressure, but it was present in every sentence she constructed. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. "This restaurant belonged to my father. My wife spent 8 years working these tables before she got sick. My son grew up in that back kitchen." His voice did not waver. "There is no number that changes that. I'm sorry you drove out here." Victoria had heard variations of that speech before: the emotional attachment, the family history, the sentimental valuation. She had learned that most people who gave that speech eventually took the money once the number got high enough. She nodded, thanked him for his time, and left. She told her team to increase the offer to $3.2 million and resubmit. The second offer came back declined within 24 hours. She returned to the restaurant on a Thursday morning this time, with 2 members of her legal team waiting outside. She walked in alone. Daniel was prepping for service, and he looked up when she entered, but did not stop what he was doing. Victoria told him the new number. She told him that Harmon Capital had every legal mechanism available to pursue eminent domain facilitation through the city's redevelopment office if necessary. She kept her tone professional and her language precise. Daniel set down his knife and looked at her. "Then do that," he said. "But I won't sell voluntarily. Not to you, not to anyone." Something shifted in her chest. Not quite anger, something faster and less controlled than that. She had spent her entire professional life making sure that feeling never reached the surface. This time, it did. She looked around the dining room, the photographs, the carefully arranged chairs, the handwritten specials board above the bar, and something in her gave way. She moved across the room and swept the stack of ceramic plates from the counter with one motion. The crash was enormous in the small space. She turned over 2 chairs. A decorative mirror on the far wall came off its mount and split down the center when it hit the floor. The staff had gone completely still. Nobody moved. Victoria stood in the wreckage she had made, breathing hard, her hands at her sides. Daniel had not stepped back. He had not raised his voice or reached for his phone. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had since she walked in, not afraid, not angry, not even particularly surprised. Just present. Watching her the way someone watches a thing that is destroying itself. Behind the door to the kitchen, a small face appeared. Noah, Daniel's 7-year-old son, who had been helping fold napkins for the afternoon service, pressed himself against the doorframe with both hands covering his mouth. His eyes were wide and red at the edges. Victoria saw the boy. She turned and walked out of the restaurant without a word. She sat in the back of her car and told her driver to take her to Lenox Hill Hospital. She had a routine liver function check scheduled for that afternoon, standard protocol, following a major transplant, something she did every 3 months without much thought. She stared out the window, the entire ride watching Brooklyn give way to the bridge and then to Manhattan on the other side, and told herself that tightness in her sternum was just adrenaline. The appointment was quick. Her numbers were stable, as they almost always were. She was pulling on her coat to leave when a junior resident came in to hand off a folder to the attending physician and placed the wrong chart on the edge of the examination table. The attending reached for it immediately and apologized, but not before Victoria had already seen the name printed at the top of the donor documentation that had been misfiled into her folder. Daniel Reeves. The attending physician's apology continued somewhere in the background. Victoria stood with the folder in her hands and read the date. 3 years ago. The surgery. The anonymous donor whose partial liver had kept her alive through a night that her own doctors had told her later was closer than they let on at the time. The same man whose restaurant she had just destroyed. The same man who had stood in the rubble without flinching and watched her leave. Victoria sat down on the examination table because her legs had stopped working correctly. The attending was still speaking. She was not hearing any of it. She was looking at the name on the document, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely no idea what to do next. She did not sleep that night. Victoria sat in the back of her car for 40 minutes outside Lenox Hill before she told her driver to take her home. She went upstairs, poured a glass of water she didn't drink, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her apartment, looking out at the city the way she always did when she needed to think. The city usually helped. Grids and lights, and the logic of a place that rewarded people who moved fast and decided clean. That night, it gave her nothing. The document she had seen was real. She had read it twice before the attending took it back. The date, the blood type notation, the surgical record. 3 years ago, while she was unconscious on an operating table, Daniel Reeves had been in the same hospital, watching his wife die in another room. And in the middle of that, he had agreed to give a portion of his liver to a stranger. He had not known her name. He had not known anything about her. He had simply said yes. And she had walked into his restaurant and destroyed it. Victoria did not deal in guilt as a rule. Guilt was a feeling that required you to stop moving, and stopping was the one thing she had spent her entire adult life refusing to do. But this was not guilt exactly. It was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing somewhere and realizing the ground beneath you is not what you believed it was. She returned to Brooklyn the following morning. No driver this time. No legal team waiting outside. She took the subway, which she had not done in years, and walked the last 4 blocks to the restaurant in the kind of flat gray light that makes a city look honest rather than beautiful. The front door was unlocked. Daniel was at the bar going through invoices when she came in. He looked up, and his expression settled into something closed and waiting. Victoria stood near the entrance and said she knew. She told him she had seen the donor file by accident at the hospital. She told him she understood if he didn't believe her, and she told him that nothing she was about to say was intended to change what she had done. Then she said she wanted to cover every cost of the damage from the day before, full restoration, every broken piece replaced, and if he needed the restaurant closed for repairs, she would cover lost revenue for however long that took. She also said she would find him an equivalent property in the same neighborhood, better square footage, lower lease, and she would fund the build-out entirely. Daniel set down the invoice he was holding. "I didn't do what I did so that someone would owe me something," he said. "That's not how it worked. I don't want your money, and I don't want a different building. I want you to leave." Victoria had prepared for several responses. She had not prepared for the specific weight of that one. She left. She sat on a bench 2 blocks away for a long time. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the corner, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood continuing without any awareness of what she was carrying. She had offered the only tools she had: money, resources, problem-solving capacity, and they had landed like nothing. Less than nothing. And the strange thing, the thing she could not quite process, was that she understood why. For the first time, she understood exactly why, and that understanding did not make her feel better. It made her feel the full size of what she had done. 2 weeks passed. Marcus Webb had been a peripheral irritant for most of Victoria's career, a rival developer who operated in many of the same Manhattan and outer borough markets, who had lost deals to Harmon Capital more times than he had won them, and who had the particular quality of a man who never forgot a loss. Victoria knew him as a competent operator with a long memory and no particular ethical commitments. She had factored him into her business calculations for years and dealt with him accordingly. What she had not factored in was that Webb had people watching her movements. And her movements for the past 2 weeks had included multiple trips to a small restaurant in Brooklyn that had no strategic value to Harmon Capital whatsoever. That pattern to someone paying attention told a story, and Webb was always paying attention. Webb's first move was quiet. A food safety complaint was filed with the city citing undisclosed sourcing issues at Reeves & Sons. The complaint triggered an inspection. The inspection found nothing actionable, but the process took 2 days and cost Daniel his lunch service on both of them. Then a second complaint was filed from a different address. Then a negative review campaign appeared across 3 platforms, simultaneously coordinated clearly, but in a way that was difficult to prove. Then 2 of Daniel's primary suppliers received calls suggesting that their contracts with the restaurant were under scrutiny for reasons that were never fully specified. Both suppliers suspended their deliveries within the week. Daniel called Victoria on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after the first complaint had been filed. She picked up on the second ring. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, exactly, but something that had run out of patience with being reasonable. "But it's working, so you can stop." Victoria was in her office when the call came in. She stood up from her desk. "This isn't me," she said. "You'll forgive me if I don't take your word for that." The call ended. Victoria set her phone down and pulled up Webb's file on her second monitor. She had a standing intelligence operation on all major competitors, a standard practice at her level, nothing extraordinary. She started reading. By midnight, she had enough to understand exactly what was happening and exactly who was responsible. By 1 in the morning, she had enough to do something about it. She sat with that for a while. The straightforward move was to handle Webb through back channels, apply pressure where he was vulnerable, make the attacks on Reeves and Sons stop, and do it quietly enough that she never had to explain herself to Daniel or anyone else. That was how she would have handled it a month ago without a second thought. Clean, private, effective. But there was another option. She could go public with what Webb had done, not just the attacks on the restaurant, but the pattern of manufactured complaints and supplier intimidation that she could now document. It would expose Webb directly. It would also expose the fact that Victoria Harmon, CEO of Harmon Capital, had a personal connection to a Brooklyn restaurant that she had previously been trying to acquire by force. That story had edges she could not fully control. The board would have questions. The press would have questions. Victoria closed her laptop and went to the window. Manhattan was doing its usual thing, indifferent, luminous entirely, without opinion about what she decided. She thought about Daniel standing in the wreckage of his dining room without stepping back. She thought about a 7-year-old pressing his hands over his mouth behind a kitchen door. She thought about a man sitting in a hospital on the worst night of his life and still choosing to say yes to a stranger. She made her decision. The next morning, Victoria called her head of communications and told him to prepare a statement. She called her lead outside counsel and gave her 30 minutes of instruction. Then she drove to Brooklyn. She did not go inside the restaurant. She stood on the sidewalk outside and called Daniel's number. When he answered, she told him that Marcus Webb was behind every complaint and every supplier problem, that she had documentation, and that she was going to address it publicly. She told him she was also sending a repair crew to the restaurant that afternoon to finish restoring the damage from 3 weeks ago. She asked him not to turn them away. There was a long stretch of quiet on the line. Then Daniel said, "Why are you doing this?" Victoria looked at the restaurant's hand-painted sign above the door. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said. It came out simply, without calculation. She meant it. She heard Noah's voice somewhere in the background on his end, bright and unself-conscious, asking his father something about what was for lunch. Daniel said, "I won't turn the crew away." He ended the call. Victoria stood on the sidewalk a moment longer, then walked back to her car. Her communications director called. Her counsel called. Her assistant called with 3 separate scheduling conflicts that needed resolution. The day compressed back into its usual density of decisions and obligations. But something in her chest had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way she could have pointed to and named, just a degree or two, enough to feel different from the inside. The repair crew arrived at Reeves and Sons at 2 that afternoon. Daniel stood in the dining room doorway, watching 2 men carefully remount the replacement mirror on the far wall. He did not speak to them. Noah came out of the kitchen, looked at the mirror, going up, and then looked at his father. "Is the lady coming back?" Noah asked. Daniel watched the workers make their adjustments. "I don't know," he said. Noah considered this with the gravity that 7-year-olds bring to things they've decided are important. "I think she is," he said, and went back into the kitchen. Victoria's public statement naming Webb's coordinated interference ran the following morning across 2 major business publications. Her legal team filed simultaneously. Webb's response was to go on offense within 48 hours. Fabricated documentation alleging financial irregularities at Harmon Capital began circulating in the press. It was clumsy work, the kind that betrayed urgency, but it was enough to create noise. The story ran in 3 outlets before anyone had verified a word of it. While the fabricated story was still spreading, Webb made a separate move. He went directly to Daniel. He showed up at Reeves & Sons on a Wednesday morning, before service sat down at the bar uninvited and put a number on the table that was higher than anything Victoria had offered. He told Daniel plainly that Victoria Harmon had been suspended from her own company, that she no longer had the authority or the resources to protect anyone, and that the smart move, the only move that made sense for a man with a son to raise and a restaurant to keep, was to take the offer and stop waiting for someone who could no longer deliver. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting. When Webb finished, Daniel picked up the envelope with the offer inside, held it out, and said, "Take this with you." Webb left. But the conversation sat with Daniel in a way he hadn't expected, not because the offer was tempting, but because part of what Webb had said was true. Victoria had lost her position, and Daniel had no guarantee of what came next. By the end of that week, Harmon Capital's stock had dropped 11%. 2 institutional investors had called requesting explanations, and the board had requested an emergency session. Victoria drove to the 57th Street office on a Friday morning knowing what the session would produce. She had done the math the night before. The board was not wrong by their own logic. A CEO under active public scrutiny during a securities-adjacent allegation was a liability until the allegation was resolved, and resolution would take time. They would move to suspend her temporarily. She understood the mechanism. She had helped design it years ago for exactly this kind of situation. She walked into the boardroom at 9 in the morning and sat at the head of the table and listened to the resolution read aloud. Temporary suspension of executive authority pending internal review. Unanimous vote. She signed the acknowledgement form and stood up and thanked them for their time. She left her keycard on the table because it was the professional thing to do. The elevator down to the lobby took 45 seconds. Victoria stood in it alone and watched the floor numbers descend and thought about the fact that she had been building toward this office, this company, this position for her entire adult life, and that the elevator was currently taking her away from all of it, and she did not feel the way she had always assumed she would feel if this ever happened. She stepped out into the lobby. The silver letters of her name on the directory caught the light as she passed them. She walked out through the glass doors onto 57th Street, and the city absorbed her into its current without ceremony, as it always did, as it did with everyone. The office was empty by the time she came back to collect a few personal items that evening. The cleaning crew had already been through. The chairs were pushed and the monitors dark, the surface of her desk cleared to the kind of neutral blankness that made it look like no one had ever worked there at all. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked in and sat down in her chair anyway. She had nowhere to be. That was the specific strangeness of it. For the first time in 11 years, she had nowhere to be, and no call scheduled, and no decision outstanding that required her input. She sat in the chair and looked out at Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and tried to locate somewhere in her chest the feeling she had always associated with this view, the particular satisfaction of having built something and being able to see it from above. It was not there. In its place was something quieter and harder to name. She had been sitting there for nearly 2 hours when she heard the elevator open down the hall. Daniel Reeves walked into her office carrying a manila folder thick enough to require both hands. He was not dressed for a meeting. He looked like a man who had come directly from closing his restaurant for the night. He still had the faint smell of a kitchen about him, something warm and specific. He set the folder on her desk without preamble. Webb has been running this playbook for years. Daniel said. "Not just against you. 3 other operators in Brooklyn and Queens in the past 4 years manufactured complaints. Supplier pressured the same sequence every time. 2 of them closed. 1 settled privately." He tapped the folder. "I talked to all of them. I have statements, documentation, and in one case a recorded call where his associate made the threats directly." Victoria looked at the folder, then at him. "How long have you been putting this together?" "Since the second complaint hit my restaurant," Daniel said. "I didn't know it was Webb at first. I thought it was you." He said it without accusation, simply as a statement of what had been true. "When you told me it wasn't, I went back and looked at the pattern differently." Victoria opened the folder. The documents were organized carefully. Dates, names, a timeline that cross-referenced Webb's known acquisition targets with the complaint filings that had preceded each closure. It was thorough work, the kind of work that took sustained attention and a willingness to spend weeks on something with no guaranteed outcome. "I'm not doing this for you," Daniel said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm doing it because Webb will do this to someone else if nobody stops him." He straightened up. "Use it however you want." He turned to leave. Victoria spoke before he reached the door. "You were in the hospital that night," she said. "The same night as my surgery. You were there because of your wife." Daniel stopped. His back was to her. "The attending told me a little more when I went back to ask," Victoria continued. "You were with her when she died, and then you agreed to the donation." She kept her voice level the way she kept it level when she was saying something that mattered and did not want the weight of it to be misread as performance. "I don't know how a person does that. I don't know how you were that person in that moment." Daniel stood at the door for a long moment without turning around. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "She would have done the same thing," he said. "She would have done it faster than me." He left without looking back. Victoria sat alone with the folder in front of her and the empty city outside the window. She thought about what he had just handed her. She could use it to defend Harmon Capital, to restore her position, to dismantle Webb's operation in the New York market cleanly and permanently. All of that was available to her. But as she sat with it, she understood that the question was not what she could use it for. The question was whether she was going to use it honestly, not the strategic way, not the way that maximized her position, just the right way. She had spent 35 years optimizing every decision for outcome. She understood, sitting there in the dark, that she had never once simply asked whether a thing was right. She picked up her phone and called her communications director at 11 at night. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy and alarmed. She told him to clear his morning. The press conference was not the kind Victoria had held before. There was no prepared media strategy, no carefully managed rollout. She stood at a podium in a hotel conference room on a Thursday morning, with her personal attorney beside her and the folder of documentation on the table. And she walked the room through every piece of evidence. Webb's pattern of interference, the documented cases in Brooklyn and Queens, the supplier intimidation, the fabricated financial allegations against Harmon Capital. She named names. She cited dates. She answered every question directly, including the ones about her own conduct, the acquisition attempts, the pressure she had applied to Reeves and Sons, the incident at the restaurant. She did not soften any of it. One reporter asked why she was going public rather than handling the Webb matter through litigation. Victoria looked at the camera directly. "Because the people he did this to before me didn't have the resources to fight back," she said. "And they deserve to have it on the record." It was not a calculated answer. It was the true one. Webb's legal team issued a denial by noon. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 of the Brooklyn operators who had given Daniel statements had gone on record publicly themselves, adding their accounts to the growing documentation. Webb's primary financial backer announced it was reviewing its relationship with his firm. By the end of the week, Marcus Webb had issued a statement withdrawing from all active New York development projects, pending a review of business practices. His attorney confirmed He would not be contesting the fraud allegations through the courts. Harmon Capital's board convened an emergency session 8 days after the press conference. Victoria sat at the same table she had left the week before in the same chair. The board voted to reinstate her executive authority effective immediately. The resolution was unanimous, the same way the suspension had been. She accepted it with a brief acknowledgement and moved directly to the agenda items that had accumulated in her absence. She drove to Brooklyn that evening. The restaurant was still open when she arrived late service, the dining room about half full. Daniel was behind the pass in the kitchen, visible through the order window. Victoria sat down at the bar without being shown to a seat. One of the staff recognized her and looked uncertain about what to do. She asked for coffee, and the staff member brought it quickly and found somewhere else to be. Noah appeared from the kitchen about 10 minutes later with the unself-conscious navigation of a child who had grown up treating the entire restaurant as his personal territory. He climbed onto the stool next to Victoria without asking and propped his elbows on the bar. "Dad said you were probably coming," Noah said. Victoria looked at him. He had his father's directness, the same quality of simply saying the thing that was true. "Did he?" she said. "He made the mushroom thing," Noah said with the significance of someone conveying important information. "He only makes that when something's a big deal." Daniel came out of the kitchen a few minutes later and sat down on the other side of the bar across from her. He set a small envelope on the counter between them, old, slightly creased, the kind that had been handled many times. He did not explain it. He just pushed it toward her. Victoria opened it. Inside was a single-folded piece of paper, the handwriting small and precise. She read it. "I don't know who you are. I don't know anything about you. I just know you need to live, and I know what it means to need that. So here, take it. I hope it's enough." The date in the corner was from 3 years ago, the night his wife died. The night Victoria had been unconscious on a table 2 floors away, not knowing any of this was happening. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked up at Daniel. There was nothing adequate to say. She understood that completely, and for once in her life, she did not try to find something adequate anyway. She just let the silence be what it was. Noah, who had been watching both of them with the focused attention of a child trying to understand something adult and important, leaned forward on his elbows. "Are you going to cry?" he asked Victoria, with genuine curiosity and no unkindness. Victoria looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. Noah nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. He slid off the stool and tugged once on her sleeve. "Come eat," he said. "Dad's food is better when it's hot." The Brooklyn redevelopment project broke ground 4 months later. The final design had been substantially revised. From the original plan, the footprint adjusted, the ground-level layout reworked entirely. Reeves and Sons remained on its corner, structurally integrated into the new building's base. Its entrance unchanged, its hand-painted sign preserved. The architects had built the tower's lobby around it rather than over it. In the press materials, the project described the restaurant as the building's anchor tenant. Victoria had not issued any statement explaining the change. She did not feel that it required one. On the morning of the groundbreaking, Noah ran out the restaurant door and grabbed Victoria's hand the moment she came around the corner, pulling her toward the entrance before she had finished her coffee. Come in," he said. "Dad's been ready for like an hour." Daniel was standing just inside the door. He watched his son drag Victoria across the threshold with something in his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, just a quality of recognition, like a man who has learned to be grateful for things he did not expect. Victoria let herself be pulled inside. The dining room smelled like coffee and whatever Daniel had been preparing since early morning, and the morning light came through the front windows at an angle that made the whole space look like something that had been there a long time and intended to stay. She sat down at the nearest table. Noah climbed into the chair across from her and immediately began explaining, at considerable length and with great authority, what she was about to eat and why it was going to be the best thing she had ever had. She listened to him. Outside through the window, the new building's steel frame rose against a clear sky, still incomplete, still becoming whatever it was going to be. Inside, the coffee was hot, and the morning was ordinary in the best possible way. And Victoria Harmon sat in a chair that was not hers, in a room she did not control, and found that she did not need to do anything about that at all. Some kindness begins in the deepest pain a person has ever known. It travels through lives that seem entirely unconnected, and it arrives always exactly when it is needed most.